My name is Daniel Peltz. I'm an artist, the co-director of Lemia Art Lab, an artist-run organization in rural Sweden, and a professor at the Rhode Island School of Design in the US. I wanted to start by thanking Marco for inviting me to speak today in this artist section of the symposium, and to Catherine, Victor, and Hannah for their support over the course of this project. I'm going to keep my presentation brief, as it pains me to have had to miss the opening and would seem ashamed to travel all this way over a Skype line and not have a chance to have some dialogue with you. For the past couple of years, as part of SPACE's residency program, I've been working in the iron ore mining town of Tom Price. This is a map I've made of my site. Tom Price is a purpose-built, time-delimited community, wholly owned by the multinational mining giant Rio Tinto. It was built to be a complete container for human lives. It is one of the wealthiest rural towns in the world, with 5 schools, an Olympic-sized swimming pool and recreation facility, and a mostly unused art center on the outskirts of town. It is inhabited by its share of families on 5-year plans, making some money for a down payment on a home in Australia's skyrocketing real estate market, who live in company houses and send their children to school with Rio Tinto backpacks, Rio Tinto erasers, and Rio Tinto jelly beans. On the other side of town, within the gated confines of the Tom Price mining operation, there are fly-in, fly-out workers in labor camps dealing with the psychological strains of this new labor practice. A bit further outside of town, in the Tom Price Caravan Park, there are independent contractors living in caravans and tourists on their way to visit Carragini National Park, stopping for a mine tour or to load up on supplies at Coles. A bit further still, there are 3 Aboriginal communities where a small percentage of the Aboriginal population has chosen to live outside of Tom Price. Tom Price is full of people who have lived to see the dawning of the unmanned mining era. Their tiny bodies sitting inside monstrous machines, while the machine next to them is controlled effortlessly by a joystick from Perth. Into this space I enter as an artist in residence, tethered to the intentionally faulty joystick of the Perth-based operation Spaced, and a guest of the Shire of Ashburton. An American artist in a town founded by American greed and named after an American man who purportedly made it all happen. Tom Price's was founded in the late 1960s. One story tells us of a letter Thomas Moore Price wrote back to Henry Kaiser of the great American steel company Kaiser Steel in Fontana, California. The letter he wrote as he flew over the Pilbara included this statement: "God made these mountains of iron ore, and if we can't make a mountain of money from them, then God will have wasted his time." This got things moving back at Kaiser Steel, where they were building a great monument to American industry in the form of a $267 million steel manufacturing plant, the most advanced the world had seen. With time, the iron ore flowed from a mine and town, both named Tom Price, to this facility in California. By the early 1980s, most of the American steel industry, and Kaiser Steel along with it, was bankrupt. Kaiser sold the great Fontana steel mill for less than 1/10 of what they'd paid to build it, around $20 million, to Beijing Capital Iron and Steel, who launched into a plan to send 300 workers from China to Los Angeles to take the mill apart, piece by piece, and float it to southern China, where it would once again take shape. The 300 workers arrived and lived in a hotel surrounded by a high fence due to a fear of American racism and the Ku Klux Klan. It took them a year, but they accomplished their task. And the mill floated back to China, where it lingered in pieces in several suburbs, waiting out intense opposition by several communities in China to the environmental impact of resurrecting it near their homes. Finally, it found a new, willing home in the industrial city of Baotou, Inner Mongolia, where it now stands, operates, and continues to receive its iron ore from the town of Tom Price, Western Australia. During my first of 2-month-long research residencies in Tom Price, I shared a home with a contract manager for Rio Tinto. She lived uneasily during my time in residence with the threat of being laid off. In the impending round of layoffs, there were 3 rounds during my time in Tom Price, affecting Rio's sprawling mining operation in the region, of which Tom Price is just one part. The last layoff was of 3,000 people, the size of the entire workforce of the Tom Price mine. During this period, while everyone else around me went to their shift in the mine and ate Rio Tinto meals, or to teach at Tom Price's 5 schools, or to their public service positions at the Shire, I lived my odd little life, taking night and early morning walks in the spectacular desert landscape, reading through the archives of the town, meditating, cooking, and accepting every invitation that came my way to engage with the people around me. I became friends with a local radio broadcaster and convened some sound workshops in nearby communities. It was a hard place to be a beggar, as Marco characterized the role of the resident artist in his program. To beg in a place where everyone has come to get rich and to have their time valued. From the site, understood to include me, I culled a series of narrative fragments, little pieces of stories about the size of a single chunk of high-grade iron ore. In order for a mining operation to proceed, to be economically worthwhile, the iron ore must be a minimum of 65% pure. I applied this same metric to the quality control of the stories I mined from the site. I then sent these fragments of stories off to China to be processed by a Chinese opera company and a landscape painter into a classical Peking opera and a Chinese landscape that each told the complex story of this town, founded in American greed and ambition, and spending its last years servicing an aging American steel plant in China's Inner Mongolia. For my follow-up residency in June of last year, I attended final rehearsals with the Chinese opera company in Taiwan, met with the landscape painter, and later on in the month, brought the Chinese opera back to Tom Price to be presented to the Tom Price community at the foot of Mount Nameless, the mountain that divides the town from the mining operation. This is Tom Price on our right, and his daughter Shirley Price, who becomes a prominent figure in the narrative of the opera. The series of landscape paintings was completed in December of last year and sent directly from the painter to the Western Australia Museum for the Space 2 exhibition. Here we see the 300 Chinese workers loading pieces of the Kaiser steel mill onto boats to be transported to southern China. And this is the final image of the landscape from Fontana, California. Tom Price and Baotou, Inner Mongolia. I wanted to acknowledge and tell you a little bit about one person who was central to the realization of this work. Ji-Yoon Hee is a Taiwanese nurse who I met one evening in the Tom Price Caravan Park when I was visiting some friends there for dinner. Ji-Yoon was stopping through Tom Price on her way to Karajini, and we had a conversation about the work I was doing, specifically the Chinese opera that I was effectively writing an unconventional outline for at the time. Ji-Yoon is a committed traveler, and I suspect was drawn to something in the way this story I told her traveled from one cultural context to another, and perhaps also to the curiosity of an American artist writing a Chinese opera. We developed a correspondence, and upon her return to Taiwan, she agreed to assist me with the production. She was on a 2-year self-declared sabbatical from her nursing duties and decided this would be an interesting way to spend part of her time. Together we navigated a series of complex relationships on a very limited budget, and in the process had many conversations about the nature of contemporary art practice. I also wanted to thank Qing Shang Chung, who wrote the Chinese script and music for the opera, and the Taichung Chinese Opera Troupe and the Hsinchu City Opera Research Association, who performed the work. Lastly, I'd like to acknowledge Cheng Yi-tsu, the acclaimed Chinese landscape painter who took on this project with deep dedication and tremendous skill. Our numerous conversations were the richest elements of my experience of this project, and I'm deeply grateful for our meeting. It goes without saying that without these people's openness and curiosity, none of this would have been possible. In the interest of the discussion Marco prompted in his notes on this session around the relationship between artists, communities, and institutions, I wanted to turn our attention to a section of the artist agreement that Space distributes to each of us when inviting us to contribute to the project. They write, "While community engagement is of fundamental importance to the nature of this event, artists must not feel obliged to dilute or compromise the rigor and artistic excellence of their works. Complex, challenging, and conceptually sophisticated projects are encouraged as long as they involve the participation of local social groups or subgroups in the research and development of the work. Consensus and unanimity, while in some cases desirable, are not essential. Even small communities are made of a variety of subgroups whose views and values differ from each other. Artists are free to explore such differences." As someone who works with language and finds beauty in administrative expression, these words were striking to me and formed the beginning of a strong sense of mutual respect and kinship. But I did not find that this sentiment was shared amongst my hosts in the Shire. Many years ago, I turned away from my work in documentary filmmaking because I felt uneasy about what seemed like the inevitable betrayal of the finished film, which often fails to represent the participants in their desired light. Unsettling trusts that have developed naturally and been cultivated through frequent visits, attention given and received, and occasional cohabitation. I do find a similar tension in my current working method, and have come to question whether perhaps coming in as an artist is misleading. One of the things that draws me to deploy the role of the, quote, artist is the uncertain position that the artist and art occupy in institutional structures. There is no precedent, for example, for the role of a resident artist in the Shire of Ashburton. Problems arise, however, because the absence of an established role does not mean that there are a lack of expectations of this role. There are various flavors of instrumentalism that are critical to consider, but it seems worth considering how the deployment of the word artist in many contexts is deliberately misleading. I wanted to close with a final suggestion on finances, a call for radical transparency. I often dream of performances while in faculty meetings at the art school where I teach, and one seems to keep coming up. It's an image of a day where everyone would wear their income to school. I think this is a place where a great deal of confusion comes into play in the relationship between artists and communities, and I think it would be best if we just wore the baffling, confusing reality of the economy of art making every time we entered a new community. Thank you again for having me, and I look forward to your questions.